A vicious killer who kidnapped, tortured, and killed for years. This week we discuss the Sunday morning slasher, Carl Eugene Watts. Let's open the serial killer file. Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7, 1953 in Killeen, Texas. Carl was just shy of turning 2 when his parents ended their short-lived marriage. His father, Richard Watts, was a private first class in the Army, while his mother, Dorothy Mae Young, taught art to students in kindergarten. Due to the family's unfortunate circumstances, both Carl and his young sister moved with their father to Inkster, Michigan. It was during this time when the mother began occupying herself with teaching and regrouping herself after the divorce. This left Carl in the hands of his grandmother, who fondly remembered him having a passion to hunt and skin rabbits while he was just a child. While in his grandmother's care, Carl adopted the nickname Coral due to the common southern pronunciation that was frequently used by his grandmother and cousins. It was a matter of years before his mother remarried a gentleman named Norman Caesar, a mechanic who himself had 6 of his own biological children. Together, the couple had 2 daughters of their own, leaving Carl often feeling isolated and alone in such a large family. As he transitioned into adolescence, Carl began to have fantasies of love and sex. However, these fantasies were anything but charming. At age 12, Carl began to fantasize about girls. Instead of fantasizing about relationships, he envisioned the gruesome acts of torturing and killing girls and women who were much older and younger than him. In school, Carl was described as a strange student who often enjoyed stalking girls. His academic life fell apart when he was 13 after he was diagnosed with meningitis, an infection that affects the membranes which aid in shielding the brain and spinal cord. Dealing with a harsh sickness, Carl had no choice but to be held back from the 8th grade for lack of attendance. It was speculated Carl had sustained brain damage due to the fact that he struggled with his grades and had the reading capabilities of a 3rd grade student when he was 16 years old. The struggle of keeping up with his peers resulted in severe bullying while in school. Because of this, Carl continued to live with an introverted personality. In order to save up extra spending money, Carl became a paperboy, delivering local newspapers to loyal customers in various neighborhoods. On June 29, 1969, while delivering papers, Carl knocked on the door of 26-year-old Joan Gave. Upon opening the door, Joan was unexpectedly attacked as Carl struck her repeatedly until she began screaming in fear. The alarming noise of her cry for help caused Carl to walk off the property, continuing his deliveries as if the violent altercation had never occurred. In no time, police were able to apprehend him, and when questioned for his actions, Carl simply stated, "I just felt like beating someone up." Carl was institutionalized at Lafayette Clinic, a medical hospital which was able to determine that he had suffered from mental retardation with an IQ of 68. Psychiatrists later reported that Carl was an impulsive individual who had a passive-aggressive orientation to life and struggled for control of his strong homicidal impulses. He was thought to exhibit a delusional thought process and was later released on November 7th of that same year. While in high school, Carl felt the only way he could release his violence was through physical sports which exerted his body, such as track and football. Though he struggled to excel in his studies, Carl graduated in 1973 and went on to receive a football scholarship to play for the team at Lane College in Tennessee. Reaching a great achievement in his life, Carl was hoping for a much better future. However, this was anything but the case. A fresh start, Carl awaited his year playing college football. However, his time would be cut short when he suffered a severe leg injury that gave him no other option but to drop out and return back home to his mother in Detroit. Within a year's time, Carl later went on to enroll himself in Western Michigan University. It was here where things began to take a dark and violent turn. Reports of female students being stalked and assaulted on and off campus began to arise. Carl was soon caught stealing plywood from the university, but had not been charged for it. On October 30th, 1974, 20-year-old Gloria Steele received a knock on her door from an unknown man who appeared to have been seeking out a man named Charles. Generously allowing him in, Gloria was brutally tortured and murdered, being stabbed a total of 33 times. Because of his previous record of violence and with the help of women who came forward in identifying Carl, he was arrested for his actions and had confessed to attacking a minimum of a dozen women. but never cared to acknowledge the murder of young Gloria Steele. Knowing he was a danger to society, Carl was once again ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation at Kalamazoo State Hospital before his court hearing. Psychiatrists were able to learn that the man they had taken in had lacked any remorse for his attacks and was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. During his stay in the hospital, Carl fell into a deep depression and attempted to commit suicide by hanging himself with a cord, but he failed. By 1975, doctors had determined that Carl posed a danger to himself and to society. He was eventually sentenced to 1 year in prison. Unfortunately, he never stood trial for Gloria's murder because prosecutors lacked strong enough evidence to convict him. He was released in the summer of 1976, eager to resume his deadly campaign against women. Shortly after his release, Carl took the time to date and had his own daughter with an old friend named Dolores Howard. Living with a strained relationship, the couple broke up, and in a matter of months, Carl married Valeria Goodwill. During their marriage, Valeria described Carl as a man who experienced constant violent nightmares and lived a messy and unusual lifestyle. He would cut up houseplants with a knife and would leave clothing everywhere, including the garage floor. Though it seemed that Carl would take time and settle down and stray away from his violent past, the worst was yet to come. Over the next year, many reports of women being attacked and murdered had risen in the news. One that was broadcasted was of 44-year-old Jean Klein, a Detroit news reporter who had been violently stabbed 11 times with a screwdriver on Halloween night in 1979. 6 months later, 17-year-old Shirley Small was stabbed twice in the heart while walking home. In July of 1980, Glenda Richmond, the manager of a local diner, was stabbed 26 times outside her home. Later in that month, Lily Dunn was seen kicking and screaming in her driveway. Witnesses watched as a car sped off with Lily screaming in the front seat. On September 14, 1980, 20-year-old Rebecca Huff was found dead. She had been stabbed over 50 times. In November of 1980, 63-year-old Lena Bennett was found hanging in her garage. She had been sexually assaulted and choked to death. Great concern consumed locals in Ann Arbor, Michigan, as the bodies of many women had been appearing. In pursuit of catching the killer, newspapers began to nickname Carl as the Sunday Morning Slasher. Officers were able to catch a break when they noticed a suspicious driver following a woman around Ann Arbor's main street at 5 in the morning. Once the woman realized she was being followed, she tried to hide in a doorway in fear as Carl searched for her. Police described Carl as a man who almost went nuts after losing his victim. Carl was arrested for using an expired vehicle license. It was at this time when police searched his car and discovered a wood filing tool, screwdrivers, and a dictionary that had the words "Rebecca is a lover" etched onto the book, which had previously belonged to murder victim Rebecca Huff, tying Carl to the crime. After hours of questioning, Carl refused to reveal any information he knew on the murder, giving officers no choice but to release him for a lack of evidence. Felony investigator Paul Bunton was adamant on tracking Carl. Round-the-clock police surveillance was placed on Carl, and because he had realized that he was risking his chance at killing, he moved to Columbus, Texas in the spring of 1981. With Michigan police on their toes at catching their killer, they took every chance they could to prevent future murders, and to do so, Carl's criminal records were immediately sent to Houston police once they were able to trace his whereabouts. Believing that Carl was the main suspect in several violent murder cases, police tried everything they could but ultimately lacked any significant evidence to tie Carl to multiple women. It became incredibly difficult to tie Carl to the murders as he had multiple ways of killing, such as strangulation, bludgeoning, stabbing, slashing, and drowning. Carl made it more difficult to track himself due to the fact that he rarely performed any sexual acts on any of the women. Time was running out for Carl as police worked hard to do anything they could to bring him to justice. On May 23, 1982, Carl was arrested after attempting to break in and drown 2 women living together in Houston, Texas. In August of 1982, Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones bargained a deal with Carl, stating that he could get immunity for murder and would be charged with burglary with the intent to murder if he'd simply give up any information on his victims. Carl agreed and later confessed to attacking 19 women, murdering 13 of them, also taking the time to show officers the burial sites of 3 victims. Carl confessed to the murder of Jean Klein, the drowning of Linda Tilley in 1981, the stabbing of Elizabeth Montgomery, the strangulation of Elena Samander, and eventually claiming to have killed a total of 40 females, implying that more than 80 could have possibly been tied to him. Carl had often kept keepsakes of his victims and would eventually burn the items in hopes of ultimately killing the spirit. When questioned, Carl's main motive was that each of the random female targets appeared to have had evil eyes, according to him. In court, Carl pled guilty to 1 count of burglary with intent to kill, just as he bargained for. He eventually received 60 years in a penitentiary, and just before leaving, he told investigators, "You know, if they ever let me out, I'll kill again." Once in jail, Carl attempted but failed to escape from jail and eventually turned to legal methods and began appealing his sentence. In 1989, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed Carl's case and stated that the judge had previously failed to inform Carl that the bathtub water he attempted to drown Lori Lister in was construed as a lethal weapon. Because of this mistake, Carl was not required to serve his entire sentence, and despite all of his disturbing killings, he was eligible for release in May of 2006, making him one of the first serial killers to be legally released in U.S. history. Petrified and angry family members of victims protested Carl's release. In 2004, after 22 years, Joseph Foy came forward in describing the horrific acts of witnessing one of Carl's victims, Helen Dutcher, struggling to survive as she had been violently stabbed 12 times in an alleyway back in December of 1979. With further investigation into the cold case, Carl was eventually charged for the murder of Helen Dutcher and was sentenced to life in prison. A few months into the case, Carl was struck with a guilty verdict for the death of Gloria Steele and was sentenced to life imprisonment without a chance of parole on September 13, 2007. At the last moment, fate seemed to have swept in to keep Carl locked away in prison. However, his sentence was unexpectedly short. Carl was incarcerated at a maximum security prison in Ionia, Michigan. As many in the public assumed that Carl would serve his life sentences for a number of years to come, Carl's life was cut short when he died of prostate cancer on December 21st of that same year in a Jackson, Michigan hospital. Carl Watts was 53 years old. That's all for this episode. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to learn more things about serial killers or other dark topics, be sure to subscribe to my channel now, and I will see you next Sunday.